Death Stranding Director's Cut is out on PC and is a rather known quantity. John Linneman looked at the PS5 version last year, so we really already know about the changes that it entails over that original version of the game. And on PC there are not many additional changes above that. So in today's video on DF covering the PC version, I'll be doing something different. We have that PS5 version with known quality settings, and we have the PC version. I will benchmark PC GPUs against that PS5 version. And in doing this, we will get an idea of how PC GPUs stack up against the PS5 GPU in this game. But before I get into the benchmarks, let's take a look at the few changes on PC here with the Director's Cut. First of all, the new version of the game ships with a newer version of DLSS. 2.3.7 according to the files. This will reduce and eliminate trails seen in the older version of DLSS. For example, these tardigrades flying towards the sky no longer have any darkened tail following them to the ground. Sure, you could get the same effect by replacing DLLs, like I mentioned in my video covering DLSS 2.3, but it is nice to see officially added here. The game will eventually also have Intel's XeSS image reconstruction technique, but the game version I have right now does not have it at all, and I imagine that will come out when Intel GPUs are more widely available. In terms of CPU performance, not much has changed with the new release. The one thing I can see is that when the game is now CPU limited, it is around 6% slower on average over the course of this benchmark I made here. This isn't too big of a difference, and I imagine this comes down to the changes in level geometry at a distance that John's video talked about back in the day. GPU-wise, there's also not much going on here that is different. Benchmarking the old game versus the new game, we can see that the RTX 2060 Super and RX 5700 at the same settings perform much the same, with just margins of error differences between the two versions. We see that same spread as before even. The 5700 is 5% faster than the RTX 2060 Super on average. Much like the last release, this release favors AMD in general in the usual head-to-heads, as the RTX 2060 Super is actually usually statistically ahead of the 5700. The one area of performance I did find a notable difference in was in loading. Here, a cold boot into a save from the main menu in the original version takes around 13 seconds. In the new version, that cold boot took 10 seconds, and there's no more press a button to continue after loading a save. And with that being said, we come to our first PS5 comparison here. Running a cold boot of the same save location on both platforms, we could see a 4-second load or so on PlayStation 5 and a PC loading in at around 10 seconds with a 3.5 GB per second NVMe SSD. That is the cold boot experience in this game. But if you load up a save after already having played for a while, you get different results. For example, loading up this save location here after already having played on both machines shows a little under 3-second load on PlayStation 5 and a little over 3-second load on PC. Given these differences, I was curious to see if we're looking at a software or hardware limitation here on PC, so Will Judd tested out these same loads for me on a Mambo PC with a 12900K and a 7.5 GB per second NVMe SSD. And thanks to Will's testing, I was able to find out that no matter how good your hardware is, you really can't improve loading on PC beyond a certain limit. That CPU, which is much faster, and SSD, which is much faster, loads the game nearly the exact same in both circumstances. So loading on PC is better in this newer version, but you can only improve loading so much before you hit an artificial ceiling. So let's move on to those GPU benches against PlayStation 5. And let's talk about the limitations of the comparison that I can make. For one, we need the PlayStation 5 version dropping frames from 60 to do this comparison at all. We can do this by having the game set to prioritize quality mode, which runs the game at native 4K on PlayStation 5, and importantly, it has unstable performance when using this mode. We're going to exploit this to compare against PC GPUs. Secondly, we need to be mindful that we are limited by Vsync here on PlayStation 5. We are seeing the PS5's GPU maxed out when it's not hitting 60 FPS, but the frame times of these frames are being distorted by Vsync. They're either 16.6 milliseconds or 33.3 milliseconds usually. This ping-pong nature of the frame times will have an effect on the average frame rate number to a degree. So for things to be equal on PC, we need to have the same Vsync limitations, and this will limit how we can test on PC. So the next challenge is to find a reliable bench area for PlayStation 5. And an area I found here is this 30-second sequence. It's a cutscene, so it's easily repeatable. the frame rate is below 60 FPS for the entire 30 seconds before this car crashes. This is perfect for a benchmark. We know that this is a GPU limitation on PlayStation 5 because if you use the prioritized performance mode, which reduces resolution to 1800p, this cutscene in fact runs perfectly and no longer has frame rate drops, which means we know that the PS5's GPU is hitting its limit here in this 4K quality mode. As a small little backup, I also found an area in gameplay where if we stare here at this waterfall, we see that the PlayStation 5 is below 60 FPS. So essentially, we can test the GPU performance here as well. Now we have to set this up on PC and do it right. First, I had to make sure we had all the right settings, and this is easy as the default settings in this game provide the console experience. It has that same level of middling anisotropic filtering, the same quality of shadow maps, the same distance at which objects change their LOD. It's really easy to match here and double check. Secondly, the CPU needs to not get in the way of our GPU performance, and this is pretty easy as my testing showed off earlier that this game is definitely not CPU limited to 60 FPS on a big Core i9-10900K. And next, we have to set up Vsync properly on PC. Now, usually this would be simple, but Death Stranding is curious as its Vsync on PC exhibits frame rate smoothing like an old Unreal Engine 3 game if you've ever seen that before. It looks like this on an RTX 2060 Super. Slightly below 60 FPS with GPU utilization near maxed out with Vsync on, and the frame rate smoothing kicks in when I move the camera, and it drops to a hard 40 FPS even though GPU utilization is far below 100. The game essentially tries to keep the frame rate to certain intervals that it considers smooth. To override this behavior, we need to have real triple buffering that allows the GPU to be used to the fullest. To do this, I essentially made Windows Desktop Manager composite the game while Vsync was off in the menu by alt-tabbing. And as you can see in this comparison here, we have real triple buffering with the GPU utilization being full, and we aren't seeing that frame smooth behavior that we can see when the in-game Vsync is on. So let us start those benchmarks now. And here with a GPU that I know will not reach the PlayStation 5's level of performance, and that is the RTX 2060 Super. Checking this GPU in the bench, we can see how on average it achieves over the total bench run 71.2% of the PS5's performance here. And as you can see, we know the bench is working correctly. We see parallel lines between the PlayStation 5 performance and 2060 Super. These parallel lines moving next to one another are exactly what you want to see when doing benchmarks. This allows us to see that the GPU is in fact limiting performance. Now let's go to the counterpart on AMD's side, the RX 5700. Here that GPU is performing better than the 2060 Super. It achieves 75.4% of the PlayStation 5's performance here at the exact same settings. Now let's move up the ladder on AMD's side to RX 5700 XT. We can see a bump in performance again, but honestly one that is not as large as I thought it might be. The 5700 XT achieves 83.5% of the performance of PS5 here. Now let's switch back over to Nvidia and look at the RTX 2070 Super. Here that fares much better, running the same scene with 88.5% of the PS5's performance, and if you look toward the tail end of the benchmark, it actually has a very similar level of performance to the PlayStation 5. Now lastly, let's go to the RTX 2080, which is one step up from that 2070 Super, and we can see some interesting results. Over the course of the benchmark, the 2080 achieves 96.6% of the PlayStation 5's performance. And we can also see at the end of the benchmark how the lines of performance merge, which points that the nature of the content on screen makes these GPUs more or less similar. But with the RTX 2080, I am out of GPUs that I can reasonably test in this scene here. The RTX 2080 Ti, for example, in that scene is just cruising at 60 FPS, so we can't get an accurate percentage of its performance above the PlayStation 5 due to Vsync and how this game handles cutscenes. Looking at the numbers in total, I see the PlayStation 5 here as straddling the point between an RTX 2080 and an RTX 2080 Super in terms of performance. Now let us check that backup waterfall scene. Here we see something very similar, but all the GPUs end up being a little bit closer to PS5 levels of performance. The 2080, for example, is 97.6% of the PlayStation 5's performance, where it was 96.6% before. The 5700 XT is 85.7% of the performance, where it was 83.5% of the performance before. Once again, I would say that the PlayStation 5 is on a level between the 2080 and 2080 Super. So we've run the tests, and now we need some interpretation of our results. If I were to use an educated guess, I would say we are looking at the PlayStation 5's GPU performing to its fullest here in Death Stranding. Death Stranding is a last-gen game at heart, which means its CPU usage is trivial to hit 60 FPS. Remember, as Mark Cerny described in the Road to PlayStation 5 presentation, the less strain there is on the CPU in the PlayStation 5, that means more power can be provided to the GPU so it could run at its highest clocks. And I imagine this is happening here in Death Stranding. This may not be the case in more modern games that have more CPU strain there, but in Death Stranding, I imagine we're seeing the GPU hitting its full real 10.28 teraflops. Regarding teraflops, let's look at the results of that first bench and compare them to the theoretical performance of the GPUs I tested, and there we see some interesting things. On the NVIDIA side, the theoretical performance in teraflops correlates really well with the evidenced performance in the benchmark. The 2080 has 98% of the theoretical performance, and it achieves 96.6% of the actual performance. That is neat to see it lining up with the napkin math. On the AMD side, the lineup is less clean. The RX 5700 achieves 75.4% of the PlayStation 5 performance with 77.4% of theoretical performance, but the 5700 XT shows a sharp fall off in efficiency. It has 94.9% of the theoretical performance, yet achieves only 83.5% of the actual performance in the longer 30-second benchmark. If I were to theorize why this might be the case, I would guess that the scene and game I have chosen here are more favorable to the PlayStation 5 specs than the RX 5700 XT's specs. They have a similar level of performance, as you can see, yet the 5700 XT achieves that theoretical performance by having more core processing units running at a lower speed, while the PlayStation 5 achieves its performance with a more narrow GPU with a higher core frequency. And I imagine this test bench favors that narrow core with a higher frequency. The last thing to point out with this bench here is that we are looking at a limited snapshot. Yes, I found a perfectly reproducible area, and that is really what benching is all about, but it is not necessarily fully representative. For example, the waterfall shows each PC GPU scoring better against the PlayStation 5 GPU than the longer bench sequence. I imagine this is because the waterfall stresses a different aspect of the GPU. Basically, depending upon your snapshot for the benchmark, you can come to slightly different conclusions. As an example, what if I used the initial cutscene where the performance drops on the PlayStation 5 at this moment due to all the particles exploding in front of the screen? If I used this instead, I would see that the RTX 2080 performs 12% faster than the PlayStation 5 here at this moment. So where we choose to bench can distort conclusions to a degree. With that being said, I think our 30-second benchable sequence was accurate enough, and its results are fascinating. On the NVIDIA side, the PlayStation 5 performed like a GPU between the RTX 2080 and RTX 2080 Super. On the AMD side, well, it really vastly outpaced its RDNA 1 cousins. In conclusion here, I think Death Stranding on PC is a boring release, and I wish it had more of its features at launch, like XeSS, or maybe it would be nice if they added in some new features like ray tracing or variable rate shading. Even with that slight disappointment, the standard nature of the release has allowed us to compare to the PlayStation 5's performance and get some interesting information about how the PlayStation 5 GPU performs in a last-gen game versus PC GPUs. And with that being said, that is enough from me for now. If you did like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support DF on Patreon to get years worth of our work in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about this video, write a comment below or follow me and DF on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex. Bring you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.